Well, Marina, welcome to ACLU on the Hill, although technically we're not on the Hill.
We're off the hill.
We're back at the ACLU offices, which you've been scarce at recently, being at the Capitol so much.
I barely recognize the place
That's
anymore.
That's right. We'll keep it warm for you when you come back. Busy week at the Hill, lots going on. Bills are moving through committees, just a couple more days of committee hearings, actually.
That's right. Monday's the last day.
And the session ends next Thursday?
It does, at midnight.
Wow. Okay. So before Sin Dine, right, which is the last sort of call to stop the legislature, what do we have happening in the legislature right now? I think there's a bill that has to do with expungement, HB 431, I believe, Representative Hutchins. Can you tell us about that bill? It's automatic expungement, which is something new and kind of exciting.
Yeah, it's a really cool bill. Right now, people can get expungements in the state of Utah for crimes after a certain period of time. If they have gone through all the things that they need to do, paid restitution, any fees, gone a certain period of time without committing any additional crimes. But that process can be sort of cumbersome. Mm-hmm. It requires, getting documentation, filing petitions in various courts, sometimes securing the assistance of an attorney. And what this bill would do would really be to make that process a lot easier. It's targeted at very low-level crimes. Mm-hmm. And says that after a certain period of time, if all the conditions are met, then those types of criminal records would just disappear off of somebody's record automatically without that individual actually having to do anything at all.
Hence the automatic aspect of it.
Right. And this is incredibly important because, having a criminal record can be a barrier in lots of different aspects when somebody is trying to get back on their feet, especially when we're looking at securing employment, finding housing. And knowing how many Americans these days actually have a criminal record, mm-hmm. It's important for us as a state, as organizations who care about criminal justice reform, to be pushing for measures like this, which make it easier for people to get back on their feet and back on with their lives in a productive way.
And Utah has made a justice reinvestment or criminal justice reform a big part of recent legislation going back a couple of years. Is this sort of the next chapter, one more step in pushing that idea forward?
I think so. We need to look at sort of all facets of criminal justice reform, who we are putting into the system. But this is an important aspect to focus on also, which is the collateral consequences that flow from a criminal conviction. What happens on the back end when you have a criminal conviction? There are all sorts of consequences that come. And so we need to really figure out ways to streamline those. When somebody has made the effort to reform their lives, we should make it easier for them to succeed.
Mm-hmm. Where is this bill right now at the Capitol?
So it is on the House floor. They're discussing Senate bills today, so unlikely it will be heard today, but perhaps tomorrow.
Okay, and just a couple more days left. We hope it gets through. There's been a lot of movement on school safety. There's a bill, HB 120, from Representative Ray Ward, which came in to the session with a lot of backers, but also a rather substantial fiscal note of over $100 million. It would be focusing on infrastructure and then sort of developing teams in schools to assess school safety and maybe try to stop events before they happen.
Yeah.
That bill has changed quite a bit in the past couple of days. Can you tell us where that bill is and what it now would do?
Yeah, so the bill just passed out of a Senate committee this morning. We worked with the sponsor sort of all through the legislative process, providing suggestions to make the bill improved from the perspective, particularly of students of color and students with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And really our concern around this issue comes from the idea that when you are placing law enforcement schools, which this bill would have done through what it called threat assessment teams, mm-hmm. The research has shown that in some circumstances, particularly students of color and students with disabilities are oftentimes referred to law enforcement at a higher rate than they should be. And so we wanted to make sure that there were protections in the bill to make sure that that sort of unnecessary referral wasn't happening. Obviously, where it's justified, that would be not as problematic. But we wanted to make sure that the bill was sort of in line with a lot of the juvenile justice reforms that were undertaken by the state in previous years. So the bill advanced out of the House, made it to a Senate committee earlier this week, where it actually died in committee because there was so much concern. Some of that concern, I think, stemmed from the fact that a lot of the funding had dried up. And so now you had what was essentially sort of an unfunded mandate from the state telling local school districts that they needed to put together these teams. So the bill died in committee. It came back to life again, as sometimes happens at the legislature. We call those zombie bills, and made its way onto an agenda again this morning, where the sponsor carved out all of the language pertaining to these threat assessment teams. And so what remains is really a bill that directs the State Board of Education to develop a lot of these types of policies and leaves for a later date, perhaps in sessions to come, this idea of school districts putting together or being mandated to have these threat assessment teams.
Really leaving it up to the State Board of Education to put together these guidelines now instead of the legislature.
That's right.
And there's another bill that deals with mental health counseling that's been making its way through the legislature, HB 373, Representative Elison.
Yeah.
And that bill puts about $30 million sort of to increase the number of mental health counselors and other sort of resources for students in schools, right?
Yeah. And, this is really exciting to see sort of these two bills move together in this way. Mm-hmm. We've seen some reports from the ACLU nationally about the fact that oftentimes policymakers are deciding to put law enforcement into schools at the expense of mental health support, and really that we need to increase that mental health support for all of our students' safety. And so what we are seeing play out here in Utah is that, in fact, the mental health is winning the day.
Mm-hmm. That's really good. I think that ACLU report was called Cops But No Counselors,
right?
And it showcased that Utah, I think, had a student-to-counselor ratio of 663 to 1. So hopefully some of these bills and investment will chip away at that.
Yep.
Let's touch on one more bill today, and that's a bill that is kind of putting Utah on the cutting edge of technology and privacy. That's sometimes where we like to be, and sometimes it's a tough place to be. This is a bill from Representative Robertson. I believe it's HB 438, and it has to do with facial recognition software on your cell phone, which is now part of some of the brand new cell phones that are coming out. My phone doesn't have it. I don't know if yours does.
Mine does. You hold it up to my face, and it instantly opens, and all of that information is available.
So that can be problematic in a criminal justice or a law enforcement perspective if you're stopped by the police. Can you tell us what this bill would do?
Yeah, so essentially what this bill does is it says that law enforcement cannot force you to open your phone with your face. Sounds pretty simple, but this is, as you mentioned, sort of on the cutting edge of some of these issues that pertain to constitutional rights and where they bump up against advances in technology. When we're talking about these questions of whether law enforcement can look into your phone, there are really two issues at play. There's a Fourth Amendment issue, which is, has law enforcement gotten a warrant so that they can hold your phone and have your phone in their possession? But then there's a second question, which deals with a different amendment, the Fifth Amendment. Can law enforcement force you to sort of self-incriminate and provide information which might implicate you in terms of committing a crime? So there are really two questions at play here, and what this legislation would do would be to try to answer those by saying, we already have existing law on the books here in Utah that would require a warrant to get the phone itself. And now this law would say, or this bill would say, that law enforcement cannot tell you that you have to open your phone with your face.
So typing in a passcode on a phone, which is the way many phones are, would sort of be like testimony, right? Like that could be self-incriminating, would violate the Fifth Amendment. You could plead the Fifth and say you don't want to do that.
Right.
But it's still unclear whether your face is the same as...
Your face or your fingerprint.
Yeah.
A lot of phones open with a fingerprint as well. Yeah, the courts have sort of long made this distinction when they're doing Fifth Amendment analysis about whether something is testimonial in nature, in which case it is usually covered by the Fifth Amendment's privilege, or whether it's non-testimonial, whether it's a physical act. And, I think that distinction probably made a lot of sense in sort of pre-technological era. But in a time where your fingerprint or your face can do the same thing as entering a password, I think we really need to take a closer look at whether that testimonial, non-testimonial distinction really makes so much sense.
So this bill is brand new. Does it have a hearing this week, I believe?
It's scheduled for a hearing tomorrow morning.
Okay, and probably a lot of education going on about many of the things you've just discussed. Is that right?
It's late in the legislative day to imagine that this bill might make it across the threshold, but it's certainly going to be a great opportunity to start the conversation, and hopefully that conversation will continue over the summer.
And as we've seen, many times criminal justice bills take a couple of sessions and a lot of education before they finally do make it through with majorities and become law.
That's correct.
Okay, well, thank you, Marina, for joining us back at ACLU headquarters. We'll catch you at the Hill next week before the session ends and get one last report on what's been happening.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.